I personally would view Stuxnet as more of a sabotage incident than an armed conflict incident. People involved in sabotage, and again, these were written back in kinetic warfare days, but the wording is behind enemy lines lose their protected status or could lose their protected status as protected combatants, which gets really interesting.
This is very exciting. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response show is Maggie Morgante. She is a product security researcher at Schneider Electric. Welcome to the show, Maggie.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I wanted you up on stage. So what we're actually going to talk about, you submitted early on in the S421 call for presentations, and it was a no-brainer. It was, I want this on stage. So I was really excited about it. And then, of course, as everyone knows, we had to cancel it. We couldn't hold an in-person event. So I appreciate you reaching out and reminding me about it, because this is a good topic for our podcast, and it's going to tie in really well to another interview I'm doing in a week or so with Nicole Perlroth, who has written that book on offensive efforts and what it means for the world and such. So this is going to be a good set of interviews. What we're going to talk about, I guess the key of this was you wrote a paper when you were at Oak Ridge National Labs, Permissibility of Targeting of Critical Infrastructure with Cyber Operations.
Yep.
So this was maybe a 10, 12-page paper that talked about how do we deal with this issue that people might be targeting these things. We're seeing them target these things. Mm-hmm. And you go into maybe some of the ways that society and countries can deal with this. Maybe a good place to start on this, I'm thinking of, is you talk about in your paper, a key part about this is this IHL. Can you talk a little bit, maybe as a starting point, what IHL is and why you think it might apply to this question?
Yeah, sure. So IHL is just international humanitarian law. It's also used fairly interchangeably with law of armed conflict. And it really is just a set of principles that govern what is lawful conduct in wartime. Things like what weapons are permissible, what is lawful kind of conduct for soldiers and combatants, what protections are afforded to soldiers and legitimate combatants, the treatment of them, should they be caught. And a piece of this that, I would really like to get into kind of once we get the show rolling is there are also some articles in it that cover some of the unique protections or lack thereof for specifically espionage and sabotage, since this was, really written before we really had the advent of cyber warfare. These things were very focused and written with kinetic warfare in mind. What we, very traditionally think of as, World War I, World War II, that sort of thing. But they still apply to everything that we're doing today. And by we, I mean, the world and nation-state governments that are conducting cyber operations. So there's really interesting tie-ins on how there's 191 different countries who have essentially signed on to this. So this governs pretty much any state and non-state actor during armed conflict. And another key word in there is armed, and what that does and doesn't mean. Mm-hmm. For different people in regards to what is a weapon, and that's something else that we can kind of get into. But to really distill it down, it's just a set of laws that internationally govern conduct during armed conflict.
And I guess the average person hears about the Geneva Convention, right? That's what we hear in the news a lot. Yep. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. Is the Geneva Convention part of IHL? Is it something separate? I was a little confused as to what the relationship is.
Yeah, so a lot of the IHL principles came out of the Geneva Convention. You can that could be its own very kind of separate podcast. That there's the laws of Geneva and the laws of the Hague. The laws of Geneva govern treatment of people during wartime and conduct of people. The laws of the Hague govern weapons more specifically, and all of those really kind of make up the Law of Armed Conflict, or IHL. So a lot of this did come out of the Geneva Convention originally.
Okay, and you mentioned 191 countries have signed on. I assume the U.S. is one of those countries?
Correct. Yeah, there's some, they signed on some additional protocols. I believe back the most recent one in my memory is 2007, that some of the major world powers didn't sign on to. But as far as the bulk of IHL and the main principles of it, the U.S. and Russia and kind of all of the world's major countries are party to this.
Okay.
And a point to bring up is that regardless, only nation states can be a treaty partner to it, but non-nation state actors can still be held accountable by it during armed conflict.
Okay. And that's where you get into the World Court and all these World Criminal Court and all that sort of thing. Okay. Yep. Well, let's dive into it a little bit here, because there were in the paper there you brought up at least two factors that you really spent a lot of time on. One is distinction, and the other is proportionality. And I found that fascinating, especially proportionality. But before we skip right to that, let's maybe define distinction in the terminology of this IHL.
Yeah. So there's three big kind of bars that need met for something being legal under IHL. The first big theme is distinction. So at all times, parties to a conflict have to distinguish between a combatant and a civilian. So it's only a legal act of war if you are targeting combatants specifically on the battlefield. It is illegal under the international humanitarian law to intentionally target civilians. So you always have to be distinguishing between who is a civilian, who is a combatant, in order for your operations during wartime to be considered legal internationally. The next one is proportionality. So you cannot cause undue civilian harm in comparison to the military gain that you're getting from that operation. So, for instance, for critical infrastructure, it would be just to use an example, it would be not viewed as acceptably proportional for me to blow up, the entire state of Iowa to target one small military base there. That would be highly disproportional. Civilian casualties, civilian loss, civilian harm in respect to the military objective you've got from maybe taking out some sort of small military installation. So it's that sort of proportionality, and that's really important to point out, because a lot of times this gets confused with is the attack proportional to whatever they're retaliating against, and that's a separate thing under international law. And then the third one that kind of ties into it is, was an act of armed conflict necessary from a self-defense standpoint, either anywhere from the personal level all the way up to the country level.
Yeah. So as I said, the proportionality one was very interesting, and you talk in the paper about some of these dual use cases, which you gave an example of. And I think for the audience here who's involved in critical infrastructure, or it could even be a factory, right? It could be a factory that produces a variety of things, or a company that produces some things that would be of value to the war effort, and also things very important like food supply or something like that. So it's interesting on that. But I guess one of the things I thought about there is, if a country wanted to protect their civilians, you could almost flip this concept on its head, right? You could say, look at power, for example. If I could say the power for my military effort was somehow separated or had resilience so that it could continue operating if the civilian one was lost, well, then that would almost negatively affect the argument that says, oh, I can attack this because it affects the military. I'm not saying that very well, but you understand my concept that
I absolutely understand. Yes. And this gets really fun in cyber, because the way we define critical infrastructure. So for for just kind of general audience awareness, kind of the closest thing we have to a binding, or not binding because it hasn't actually been ratified, but the closest thing we have to a comprehensive legal document that talks about how we can acceptably conduct cyber operations is the Talon Manual. And in the few places that it does talk about critical infrastructure, it only uses that term of, kind of thou shalt not attack critical infrastructure unless it's dual use. But if you look at the way that, us, the EU, Russia, China define what is critical infrastructure, it's everything. I mean, at this point, you can make a Toys R Us critical infrastructure.
Sure.
I feel like if you wanted to. And so there's this really interesting extra step in cyber operations that all of the sudden we get into this conversation of, is the network you may be using to go after that defense critical infrastructure is kind of what we at the lab called it, the substations that are directly supporting a military base, for instance, of, is the separate utility public network that you use to get there dual use? And one step back from that, and one step back from that. But the whole concept of dual use is exactly what you're talking about. And it's not particularly well defined. There's a lot of room for interpretation on it. But it's this whole concept of exactly that. It's a power substation that directly supplies a base. It's a hydroelectric dam that directly supplies a military installation, or a shipyard that builds Navy ships, that sort of thing. So they are traditionally civilian infrastructure that, for whatever purpose of the day it is, are also being used towards whatever the armed conflict of the day's effort is, so that they can kind of fall under, we're not a military target, but we are being used to further that effort.
And the attacking entity in this case is supposed to say, if I do this, this will be the harm to the military that I'm trying to harm,
mm-hmm.
and this will be the harm to the civilian, and they're supposed to balance that off. So if it's the easy case where it says you don't do it, if it's a massive harm to the civilians and a tiny benefit mm-hmm. from the military effort, and the easy case is the flip side of that. It's when it's somewhere in between there that a nation state is supposed to make some sort of judgment. But I want to go back to what I was thinking and try to say it a little bit better. Mm-hmm. If I am a government and I want to protect my civilians, then it's in my best interest to separate the civilian from the military purpose, because that way it's less likely they would be a target because of this proportionality argument. And I guess the flip side that we see in some unfortunate areas of the world where people co-locate hospitals and military installations to try to avoid being attacked. That's sort of, if you're not as worried about your civilians, you take that tact. Do you see that being practical in cyber, trying to actually increase separation, or is that ship sailed?
So I do see your point. I don't see it being practical. I think because, our military is specifically in the US, our military is 1% of our population, but the infrastructure that supports our military being what it is vast. I mean, it's incredibly vast. I mean, just go down to, Huntsville, Alabama, and look at all of the defense contractors there, or, kind of anywhere in the DMV and all of the defense contractors there. Or, anything in our defense industrial manufacturing base, all of the companies that, make products that support our military. I think, to your point, it could be done from, kind of what we define as like a utilities critical infrastructure. So things like water, power could potentially be kind of cordoned off in that way to prevent civilians from theoretically having their, kind of critical services targeted as a dual use. But as a whole, I think there's just too much that is considered dual use to kind of wrap our arms around doing that for all of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know that you could do it for all, but I'm thinking it almost ties into this resilience argument. where if I'm the military and I say, yes, we use private industries resources, but if those go away, we need to still be able to operate if
Sure.
they go away. So we're going to build in resilience, and the more we build in resilience, then the less benefit there is to attacking civilians. So I just found that interesting, both in terms of whether it could be practical or not. I guess it depends whether anyone actually follows these rules or not, which
Well,
maybe
so
is. Go ahead.
this is the other thing, is that under IHL, in order for in order for the hammer to sort of fall on any of these things, the step across the line has to be just grossly negligent. I mean, it has to be sort of like the In Destroyer kind of event where, this was very clearly not targeting a military base. This was kind of going after, very civilian specific populations.
Yep.
As far as we know, it has to cause a lot of harm. So the leeway in whether things are actually, kind of brought to bear for, countries making judgments in targeting on what they feel is legitimate for them to go after really has to be pretty bad in order for there to be consequences to this.
Well, consequences in terms of
International law, yeah.
international law.
Yeah, sorry, I should
A
have
lot,
specified that,
a,
yeah.
a lot of these things are their effectiveness is in people self-disciplining themselves, right?
Mhm.
If that's where they've been most successful is when everyone says we don't want to go down this path, so we're going to self-discipline ourselves. So let's shift a little bit here. You in your paper you go through 4 different examples. The 2 in Ukraine, the Triton Trisis, and the Stuxnet, and you measure them up against these. And there's a clear case that the Stuxnet one seems to follow the IHL rules. The Ukraine one clearly don't. The Triton Trisis don't. But I guess before you dive into that, I always thought that this applied if there was armed conflict. So if we look at just the Stuxnet example, is that follow IHL when there's no declared hostilities between the two, or is that violating IHL?
So Stuxnet, and again, there isn't case law around this. So this is my opinion, having done a thesis on this. Is sabotage is still defined under IHL as hostilities.
Okay.
And I personally would view Stuxnet as more of a sabotage incident than an armed conflict incident, right? I mean, going in and making things malfunction is a lot closer to espionage, espionage, and then sabotage than dropping a bunker breaker bomb on something. And sabotage is actually really unique under IHL, and specifically under how the U.S. treats international law, in that there is law and case law surrounding people involved in sabotage. And again, these were written back in kinetic warfare days, but the wording is behind enemy lines lose their protected status, or could lose their protected status as protected combatants, which gets really interesting when we start throwing cyber into the mix, because all of a sudden one could be left with having to define what is behind enemy lines. Is it a close access operation where I'm actually going and sticking a USB stick in something, or is it simply gaining access to the network? And so there's some really interesting kind of conundrums that get brought up in incidents like Stuxnet. But to answer your question, I think it absolutely does fall under IHL, under the realm of sabotage, not directly under sort of what people would think of as more of a traditional attack, which is kind of where I get a little gripey sometimes on Twitter when people talk about things like that being, cyber war, because I think that there's a distinction that kind of needs to be made there about the ramifications of what happened and response options and what is a legal response option to that from whatever country that may happen in.
Well, the cyber war question is difficult.
Yeah.
There's two, I think, good books. One said there will be cyber war, and the other one was, I can't remember Thomas Ridd's exact title, but it was something like Cyber War Will Not Happen or something like that. And they came out within a year of each other.
Yeah.
And they both made compelling cases based on their own definition of cyber war.
Yeah.
So it's a tough term, but this sabotage thing is fascinating. I hadn't heard or thought about that. So in theory, if I go in with a USB drive, like maybe they did with Stuxnet with the contractor, for example.
Sure.
If they went in and infected the contractor system to sabotage, then the person that did that might lose their protected rights.
Yeah.
And you're saying, what about the person in
wherever?
I was gonna say Maryland, but maybe that's too mean. Maybe the person in Hawaii who goes in and plants something behind enemy lines. So the impact is behind enemy lines, but the person is not. Does that lose their protected status? Well, that's very interesting.
Or to the point of, I believe that there was an S4 technical stage talk 2 years ago, where you had brought up the kind of theoretical of this, and then there was a talk about, I believe it was an old Siemens controller, that there was this discussion around. And disclaimer, I've only been at Schneider 3 months. Like, please, no one assume anything of this that it's not. But you had a discussion around. What do we do about if nation-state threat actors would approach a large vendor and say, we want to backdoor your product? And I know that there have been, I believe there was some open source reporting that may have happened to different telecom infrastructure providers at some point historically. And, things like that could be read as, espionage or sabotage behind enemy lines if one knew that products were going to be deployed there and planted a backdoor preemptively.
Yeah. And that gets really messy, because then does the company actually implant the back door? Do they say where the products are being shipped and just kind of, it's not me? Or do they let them in the factory at night? I mean, okay. We could go,
with or without knowledge, if that was at any point intercepted by a government.
Okay. So the next thing would be, boy, this is really a tough topic. I mean, there's some of the interesting Twitter conversations on this I follow, and you can just really dive down this rabbit hole, and there's not a lot of good answers. But what about preparation? So what if the attacker has not caused any sabotage, but they've gotten into the network in a position where they could cause sabotage? How is that treated?
Yeah, so this is the other part about cyber operations or cyber network operations. CNO is the DoD term, or the DoD acronym, that I just find fascinating, because in kinetic warfare, we can kind of very clearly see on sat images of what equipment they're rolling into the area, kind of what we can expect. If they're rolling a howitzer in, you kind of know what that means. But with cyber network operations, if you find a backdoor, you have no idea what the payload that could come out of that is. If it's just sitting there, I mean, it could be a payload that's just looking to exfil data. There could be no payload. They may just be listening. It could be straight espionage. Or it could be something, Stuxnet-esque, that's actually going to cause physical damage to a system. Or, Triton, Hatman, whatever you want to call it, esque, that, it might actually cause a safety issue and a human life safety issue. And so I really think that it gets messy, right? Because the proof of espionage is there. I mean, they're on the system. It's unauthorized access. But trying to prove sabotage before you can actually reverse engineer whatever is dumped on that system as payload, I don't think legally you can make a case for, as much as we would love to.
Well, I don't know if I'd love to or not. It's just a tough question. Maybe
Yeah.
it's equivalent. How would it be treated if someone had a bomb of
Yeah.
sorts, a physical bomb that they
Hmm.
put in a concert hall in a city, but they didn't detonate?
Hmm.
And there was no evidence that they were going to detonate, but they could if they wanted.
Yeah.
How does that fall under IHL? Do you have any idea? I mean, that's a tough question if you
Yeah.
don't know, but I'm
No, that's
curious.
that's an incredibly tough question, and I think that it would be incredibly situationally dependent. I think just the act of planting a bomb, and I believe I actually used the term blast radius in my paper, that
Hmm.
if you planted a bomb at a concert hall or a sports stadium,
Sure.
there's kind of this inherent intent to harm people, and we can reverse engineer the bomb and pretty specifically, based on physics, get into the number of people you could have harmed and really draw some conclusions from that. But I think with malware, especially in ICS, this gets really, really difficult. One
Hmm.
of the things that I love, kind of talking about with people in these conversations is because how, like, we know, and the general audience may not be aware of this, so I guess just a quick disclaimer that industrial control systems can respond really wonky to the most like benign scans or commands. We've had FANUC robots that did really weird things just based on an Nmap scan. So all of a sudden you can get into this situation where you could theoretically, if you had a test system as an attacker, you could write a piece of malware that you knew would make that piece of equipment respond really dangerously. But if you reverse engineered the actual malware, it would be really, really hard to prove that it intended to do that based
Hmm.
on, the actual commands the malware gave. It could look like plausible deniability unless it was something a lot more sophisticated, like a Stuxnet sort of issue where it was meant to, do very, very specific things.
Yeah, I guess I worry a little less about that. And I think the harder issue for me to grapple with is I've written a paper on this. I'll link to it in the show notes called Preparation and Persistence, way back in like 2014 or 15, and then an updated version with Dan Gear. But I put myself in the situation of I work for a nation state and they say, we want to be able to turn off the lights or turn off this factory in this potential adversarial country. I've got to be in there. It's going to take me months to get in there, do the engineering and automation to have the exact impact I want. I guess if I want to just crash everything, it's not that hard. If I want to brick anything, I can. But if I want to do something more interesting like Stuxnet or the
Yep.
Triton one, I've got to be in there for a while. So
Also,
I
apologies
almost
to anyone who's drinking every time we say Stuxnet during this. It's this is going to be a rough
well,
one for you.
Stuxnet is really key because it changed
Yeah.
so much in this area. People said this is possible now,
Hmm.
uh, but if I want to have that capability, because I think my bosses have either told me they want me to have it, or I expect someday they're going to ask me to turn out the lights. The chances of me using it might be less than 5%, but I still have to be in there, which is probably a little different than placing a large bomb in a building where it's probably more likely. So I think it's a tougher question in cyber. Who answers that kind of question?
Of the, I'm
Who
I'm
answers the
missing the
question?
specific
How
question here.
does international law deal with something, this IHL or something else, if this has not occurred? If they said, well, this pre-planned preparation deployment of cyber weapons with a low probability of being used is something that falls under an allowed or a prohibited activity. Who
Oh,
makes those determinations in general? I know specifically it could go to court, but in general, will some organization try to write code or papers around this?
yeah. I mean, so there have been, and it hasn't been to this level of specificity. There's been norms proposed. They were very broad. They were very general, and I think that was very on purpose. But to your point about, kind of unrealized cyber activity being prosecuted. I think it would really depend on at what point it was caught. And then being able to, I mean, the crux of it is proving intent. I mean, you would really have to have a solid way to either reverse engineer the payload or make a case based on TTPs that their intent was to actually cause an effect that would be outside IHL norms and what that's allowed, which
I want to
is
hit.
complicated. And you have to, in some way, also one of the other points that I love to bring up is who certifies that decision, because this is done at a government level, and it's a separate problem. But what we know about kind of this space in general is that unfortunately a lot of our best people go into government, get pretty good, and then the private sector. So how do we standardize the technical understanding of the lawyers who are going to be drawing these conclusions based on the engineers who are doing this work? And I think that's its own complete can of worms. But I do think it's going to have to be reconciled at some point.
Well, so I want to hit two other things here in the time we have left. One is, and I needed to get my glasses to read this since my eyes aren't so good anymore, but you talk about this government group of experts, GGE. Is tasked every 2 years by the United Nations with drafting a new proposal for rules governing cyberspace. And two of the rules just were like big flashing signs that would seem to limit a lot of this. One was states should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. I mean, that's pretty black and white.
Yeah.
And then the third one is very timely. States should take steps to ensure supply chain security and should seek to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT and the use of harmful hidden functions. I mean, those are, I mean, if those were the cyber norms, the world would be a very different place. Does this GGE have any effect? Does the U.S. or anyone else sign up to meeting this, or is this just a hope?
It hasn't been comprehensively ratified. It's a very should, not a must document in its nature. And yeah, to your point on that, and I was smiling when I was reading in the email you sent me prior to this that you wanted to talk about this, because in that, one of the points that they also bring up is that, and this ties directly back to IHL, is that countries shouldn't, in the enabling of ICT, cyber network attacks, it's just a different acronym, that they shouldn't allow their infrastructure to be used for it. And what's really interesting on that and how it ties back into the law of armed conflict is parties to an armed conflict using neutral countries as a base or as a stepping point without their permission. And if we think about, sort of how the internet is just inherently, how do you control that what you're sending over the wire isn't going over neutral territories infrastructure, which is really hard to prove and really hard to avoid unless you kind of have specific measures in place. And then how do countries prevent their infrastructure defensively from being used in that way? And it's an impossible standard, unfortunately, I think, to abide by, because kind of outside of the classified realms, we don't have dedicated infrastructure to attack each other over that doesn't touch civilian networks, unfortunately, which is, ultimately what that would look like if everyone adhered to it, that, none of this touches a country's civilian infrastructure, but just the very nature of cyber network attack, that's kind of impossible to do.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about this cyber norms, whether they're written into these sorts of agreements that people sign up to or whether they're informally agreed upon. We haven't seen a lot of progress in that. We haven't seen the largest states, although it was funny in your book, or in your paper, you wrote that Russia actually had one of the more restrictive recommendations to stop this, which is kind of amusing in some ways. But the U.S. has been very clear that they're not willing to pull back. In fact, they seem to be going the other direction. I have this quote I'll put up here. This was from Andy Greenberg's Sandworm book, because he kind of went down this road with a number of Obama officials saying, hey, isn't this a bad thing, what happened in Ukraine? Shouldn't we all agree not to do this? Mm-hmm. And Tom Bossert at the time said, well, he asked him that even in wartime, no one should use cyber attacks to turn out the lights on civilians. And Tom Bossert said, I don't subscribe to that policy. And Michael Daniel, he also, another former official, he was a little less certain about that. He said they reserved the right to do it within the law of armed conflict, which is what you talk about here. So I guess he's saying,
statement. Yeah. No, and then this is really where I think where a nation state can split hairs if it's in their interest to do so, because turning out the lights for civilians falls short of being a directly like a direct use of deadly force. So, blinking the lights for an hour is, I mean, I would much prefer someone to blink my lights for an hour than drop a bomb on my house. Yes. Those are very different things, but there is no constraints in a statement like that of for how long. How long are we okay with turning the lights out for civilians? Is it, for an hour where, hospitals generally have generators that can deal with that? Or are we talking about doing this like Ukraine in the dead of winter where people might not have generators? I mean, I think the best sort of picture that's very fresh in everyone's mind that we can go to is, are we willing to cause a Texas?
Yeah.
Do we have the stomach to, kind of cause a Texas-like incident where people freeze to death? And those people are civilians and those people are children. I think that statements like that get very dangerous. Depending on the kind of circumstances surrounding it. I mean, I think that there's absolutely situations where a country could get away with it if they did it, for a very short period of time on a day that was, sunny and 75 out. But I mean, if you really get into situations that cause a lot of casualties, I don't think that statement is in agreement with the law of armed conflict.
Well, I think where I have trouble is this armed conflict thing. So, for example, we have seen throughout history that when there is armed conflict, bad things happen. And we're not just talking about, dropping bombs, nuclear bombs on Japan. If you look at the bombing of Dresden, that would be hard to make the proportionality argument there. Yep. And we've seen that just throughout history. But where do you go to get an agreement for when it is not armed conflict, to say these are things that are prohibited by the people that sign up for this when there is not armed conflict? Because that's actually where I think we're having the bigger problem today.
Yeah, and so this is really where I think that the conversation needs driven far more heavily towards the participating in hostilities and engaging in sabotage side of IHL, because, and correct me if you disagree with this, because I'm happy to debate it with you, because I think you can have some interesting insight. But by nature, cyber is clandestine. I mean, getting onto the network is, a clandestine activity. You generally don't email the sysadmin and say, "Hi, I'm a threat actor. Would love to invade your network. Please click here." It's there are, by nature, just getting there makes it a clandestine activity. Mm-hmm. And that is covered under IHL, and that is directly engaging in hostilities. And I think we get caught up in having this argument back and forth about, is it armed conflict? Is it not armed conflict? And it kind of stops there, where I think we could really drive the conversation towards, let's all agree that these are, armed or not, they're hostilities. And what can we wrap around that to put protections on what is and isn't acceptable in that space?
Yeah, I do think there has to be some distinction there, and maybe that's something I need to dig into more, because things that would be permissible in what we have traditionally called a war,
Mhm.
in my mind, should be very different than things that are permissible in the environment we're currently living on, where there's a lot of, let's say, not armed conflict, but there's conflict, there's
Sure.
economic conflict, there's all sorts of conflict going on. That would be somewhere where we might get a lead, but you almost need someone to step back and say, we're not going to do this.
Mhm.
Do you agree not to do this? And that's where it seems to be really difficult. It's funny. I'll include a link to this presentation. I gave a presentation back, I think it was S4 Europe around 2016, that really looked at World War One.
Mhm.
I think a lot of times when people look at this and they think nuclear deterrence and such, I think that's the wrong way to look at this. But there were a couple of things that they had going on there. One of them was, it was like now in the cyber world, offense was believed to rule the day.
Mhm.
That the defense was almost impractical, and it was considered whoever attacked first and hardest was going to win, and defending was going to be impossible, which I hate to use the word interesting, but it's 100 years ago. Interesting, that was completely wrong, right?
Mhm.
It was one of the epic defensive struggles, and it just shows you how fast offense and defensive superiority can flip. But it almost seems like one of the problems we're having now is that, and you see this from the U.S. government as much as anyone else, they're saying the way we're going to defend ourselves is be able to smack the heck out of anyone who hits us. And we're going to hit them faster and harder and first.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to reach an agreement when your defense is based on having a strong offense. I
Well,
guess that's more of a rant, but I'll let you comment
no,
on it if you like.
and I think it's very challenging for civilians to have a say in this argument at all because of how just layers and layers of extremely high classification are wrapped around what our capabilities even are. So, civilians being able to actually and, democratically participate in what the country should and shouldn't do when they aren't aware of what is possible, I think is problematic in and of itself. But to your point about, the best defense is saying I'm going to, whack the crap out of you if you hit us. Um, it's Irony is kind of dead when you look at some of these norms proposals because the countries that are submitting them to the UN, us, Russia, China,
Mm-hmm.
are also the countries who are, kind of the best, the biggest, the baddest at doing weaponeering in this space. And so I think it rings really hollow to other countries who are developing these capabilities, like Vietnam, for instance, of what we are and aren't going to allow. And I think
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, the nuclear metaphor works. Of we don't think anyone else should have these, but like, gosh darn it, we're going to.
Mm.
And driving down proliferation in that sense, I think is really hard. And not going to end any differently than it did for nuclear, unfortunately. Um,
Well,
but yeah,
I think it's going to end a lot worse. I think it's completely impractical just because of the ease and the variance of nuclear weapons. I guess they come in various sizes and delivery capabilities, but it's fairly binary. You either have it or you don't have it. We worry a lot about someone who has it,
mm-hmm,
regardless of that other sort of thing. As North Korea is probably the best example of that.
yeah,
I would just one other comment on that is, and this was from when I gave that, I had to look up what book it was, but Thomas Schelling's The Strategy of Conflict book was one of the early game theory books. And what really struck me about that related to this was how much more conflict was likely when offense dominated.
mm-hmm,
He went through a long discussion on if people believe defense can be effective, then the rate of conflict goes down dramatically. When people believe that offense is going to rule the day, the amount of conflict increases. So we're really in a nasty situation right now that
yeah,
we have to turn around. Maybe to finish off here, you wrote your thesis on this, a much longer paper, I
yeah.
understand, than this 10 or 12 page paper that we'll link to. And we talked here for a while about a variety of issues. But what Is there anything that you think that's important for the audience that we didn't talk about on this issue or that
So
you'd like to raise?
I do, and this is the one that's going to get me in the most trouble on Twitter.
Oh,
So I'm
perfect.
glad that we saved it till the end. And it's that in this discussion, in the discussion of applying the law of armed conflict, for sabotage or hostilities or whatever we're going to call it, to cyber weapons, attribution all of a sudden becomes very important. And being able to qualify attribution with high and almost certain level of confidence becomes very, very important. And I think that there's been a lot of discussion in the private sector, at least, about attribution doesn't matter. And I would like to see that discussion driven more towards attribution may not matter to certain people, but this is absolutely vital to being able to hold countries accountable. Because I think that I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination that obfuscation of attribution makes people feel a little bit more free to take risk from a nation state perspective, because the accountability hammer may not fall on me as quickly if I can make this hard to actually attribute, A, with any level of certainty from an analyst standpoint, and B, to be provable in a court of law. I think we haven't seen a case yet where the Hague has tried a nation state level of cyber physical attack. And I think that first case that we see, because I think we're eventually going to see one, is going to be super interesting from the attribution standpoint, because they're going to have to prove in a court of law that a nation state, not a nation state inspired actor or a nation state adjacent. There's a whole like Sherman-Williams color wheel of nation state adjacent, nation state inspired, nation state sponsored actors actually were the ones who conducted this end to end. And I think that that's going to be incredibly problematic for holding anyone's feet to the fire truly when it comes to having accountability for these weapons as they get better and they get scarier.
So you would say, if I'm hearing you right, you would say attribution might not be important to an asset owner, but for a nation state, it's extremely important.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. And the people that are saying that it's not important are primarily people servicing asset owners, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a sense, they're right, but they're not hitting the whole thing. And I guess the delay issue would be huge for me if I'm a nation state. Even if I can attribute something with a high degree of certainty in 3 months, that I'm not sure what that really does for me, except for strategically. Tactically, it's almost useless.
Exactly. And I think to that point, I personally, and again, this isn't any sort of official take, but I personally feel like it's just easier, quicker, cheaper to respond. If someone did sort of a Texas level cyber attack on a piece of our energy grid and, caused that sort of loss of life, that we would retaliate. I personally feel like, the quickest, cheapest, easiest, most shock value effect retaliation for that's going to be kinetic. We're dropping a bomb somewhere because it's going to take too long to have our people write code to retaliate and do that sort of attribution. But you have to have the attribution with a very high degree of confidence before you can respond to a CS cyber network operation with a kinetic response. And I think it's going to get very squirrely the first time someone gets that wrong. And it comes out on the international stage that someone got that wrong.
Well, or even with lacking the level of confidence to convince people they got it right.
Yeah.
Because we've seen that a lot of times where certain organizations have a high degree of confidence, and then the security community comes in and says, wait a minute, I'm not, you haven't shown me anything that really makes me believe this is true. And we've seen a lot of disagreements about that. Well, I do really appreciate you coming on the show. Is this paper, are we going to be able to link to this paper? Is it out there?
I will have to run it through our legal for that,
Okay.
just because of the nature of the job, because this was something that I wrote in grad school. So for me to publish it, I'll have to just make sure that it's approved for our legal department for me to put out.
Okay.
So
Okay. Well, I'm glad we had you on even more so then, because if people can't read the paper, they need to understand this. And I think we covered a lot of it, but if it does come out, I'll definitely post that either in the show notes or in the Friday news and notes. But thank you very much for coming on the show.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Have a great one.